Hello and welcome to this MASTS webinar on beaches of Scotland. Today we're going to be diving into the archives to have a look at some historic and iconic photos of Scotland's coastline. I'm now going to introduce one of our presenters for this webinar. Please welcome Professor Bill Ritchie.
Okay, I'm here. What do you want me to say? Just introduce it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think the introduction goes back to the original surveys, which were done a very long time ago and were actually funded by the Scottish Government through Scottish Natural Heritage, and before that, other groups with interest in the coastline. It started off in Sutherland, and it seemed to be quite a success. So over the remaining, 7, 8, 9 years, we were invited in the University of Aberdeen to put a team together and do, if possible, all the beaches of Scotland. And it was almost all of them had to be sand beaches and had sand dunes and links and marker behind them. The original surveys were available in CDs with Scottish National Heritage. We think they're still available. And the original reports were all compiled into 2 final reports. One, the beaches of the Highlands and Islands, and the other one, the beaches of Scotland. So it's a huge amount of information on beaches. But the importance of the MASTS support is that here was a resource that showed these beaches, these coastline, as they were in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The cutoff point was roughly the beginning of the 90s, when digital photography replaced the old slides. My colleagues here, my friends here, have been working on how do we make these slides useful to anyone who is interested in changes to the Scottish coastline. And there's quite a lot of information available, not just the photographs themselves. If I may, I'll hand over to my colleague, Alistair Dawson, but before I do so, although my name is up front, there were other people involved, about 5 or 6 people from the geography department in that time, and we worked as a team. And could I mention the late Professor Mather, Sandy Mather, who is equal to everything we asked him to do in that period. Over to, you can edit that maybe.
Okay, can you just go to the next slide, please, Phil?
Okay. Well, when I was at Aberdeen as a student, I learned about these beaches reports, and Bill at the time was working them all the time. I was an undergraduate, and I soon became aware of what a huge amount of work was taking place. And the beaches reports, when they were finally published, were probably about half a meter high if you put them on top of each other. I can't remember exactly how many, but there was about 20.
Almost 20.
Almost 20. We have, at MASTS, we have more or less the whole 20 reports. Some of them got lost in the big basements and side buildings and cupboards, but finally we've got most of them together. And they contain a fascinating, as we look at it today, a fascinating set of reports on the status of Scotland's beaches as they were at that time. And we're really talking, as Bill mentioned, late 60s, 70s, and into the 1980s. There are recommendations in there for particular beaches where human interference has damaged a particular beach, or where there are particular problems with coastal erosion, retreat, sand dune stabilization, and so on. The thing that really stands out when you look at these reports now are the photographs. And the photographs that were published at the time were all in black and white. As we gradually managed to get the slides, the original slides taken by Bill and his team from all over Scotland, we had, instead of black and white images, we had color images. And then the task was to have these scanned, and our colleague Geethika is the main person who's been scanning the slides, and finally passing the files over to Mark and getting them online. So that's the sort of overall background. And in terms of the methods that we use, well, I was handed hundreds and hundreds of boxes of slides, and I have to go over them slide by slide and then take out those slides which were either dark or they had a very low percentage of coastline showing on them, that kind of thing, and refine the collection down into the slides that, in my view, are the ones that people would like to look at. So there's a bit of a bias there in the sense that I had to make decisions on a daily basis on which slides to keep and which to leave out. I would say also that in terms of climate change, this is proving to be, at least when I'm looking at the slides in the original form, a real eye-opener, because, for example, the biggest El Nino event in the 20th century was during the winter of 1981-1982. And it just so happens that at the time, it was the stormiest winter in Scotland, and there were huge amounts of beach erosion and damage to coastal defences and so on. Now, whether or not places like Scotland can be affected by climate changes in the Pacific is another question, but there was a pattern there that was really interesting. So if we move on to this winter, we're living through another very big El Nino event, and is it a coincidence, or is there some scientific foundation to the notion that there's some sort of relationship between winter storminess in Scotland, damage to coastlines, and big El Nino events in the Pacific Ocean? These are all questions, the types of questions that there are no easy answers to, but the fact that we have this archive back from not only the early 80s, but into earlier periods, the 70s and the 60s, when Bill started this work, puts us in a great place to interrogate these slides and not only try and understand them in terms of climate change and storminess changes, sea level changes, and so on, but also some of the aspects of human adaptation to coastal change. And we'll see that in some of the slides that we're showing today. We're only showing 8, but there are hundreds and hundreds of these slides that are presently being digitized. So this launch does not coincide with the release of all of the images that we're working on, but it's a kind of an initial set so that we can get the ball rolling.
Next slide, please, Phil. And do you want to just go on to the next one, Phil?
Okay, can I just one
Yeah, Bill, you
just to add to Alistair, who's given a great description of all the work that's been done. we're using the beaches of Scotland as the base, but we hope that we could feed in other colour slides of the Scottish coast for the same period of time. And I think the system has been designed to expand and in that way get better over time.
Okay, so here's the first of the set of 8 that we've picked out just to illustrate some of these the things that we've been discussing. This first one is from Tentsmuir, the beaches at Tentsmuir in Fife, just on the south side of the Tay estuary. And this is a really interesting area in terms of coastal change, because it's one of 2 main areas in Scotland where there has in recent decades been a sustained accretion or buildup of sediment. The other one is on the Eden estuary, slightly further south. And so this is a specific image from 1967. So those
74.
Sorry, 74. And so those who are interested in trying to understand these changes can go to an image like this and compare it with what the beach and the dune landscape looks like today. And believe me, there have been big changes, and we're looking at therefore at changes over in excess of 50 years between then and now. So let's try the next slide. Right, this one is at Peace Bay and in the Borders, and we put this one in today to give you a perspective on another issue, is how humans what recreation in particular, what effects recreational activities have on coastal change. Many of the slides that Bill and his team took, not only from the East Coast as here, but in the North Coast and in the Western Isles, and have got lots and lots of vehicles and caravans down on the coastal zone. There's cars parked on the back of beaches. There's caravans. There's parking right up onto the dune fringe at the rear of specific beaches. And then, of course, later on, as Scotland became more climate aware and of the sensitivity of these soft coastal landscapes to recreational pressures, there were changes put in place. Bollards stopping people parking at the rear of beaches, and more educated set of choices in where to put caravans and so on. And of course, there's a landscape here too, which you can see. You can see some erosion at the far end in this particular slide. So when we were putting individual slides onto the database, we would, against each image, put some notes and descriptors of what was on the particular slide. It might, in a case like this, be simply beach recreation, but in other instances it might be we put a note that there's a raised beach there, or a shore platform, or a dune cliff, or shore erosion, that kind of thing, in order to give the person who is looking at the slide some sense of what is there. Okay, the next one. And then out here, this third image is from South Uist, and you'll notice there the date is 1964. And I was chatting with Bill. This is, he won't want to admit this, but this is from his PhD research. when he was working out in the Western Isles, mapping coastal landforms and interpreting coastal change and studying the macar and so on. And in an image like this, there's great historical importance because you can look at some of the land use here on the macar. There's not so much in this particular image about coastal erosion or storminess change, but there's lots of interest for those who are trying to interpret land use change in parts of Scotland or the Western Isles. And things like this are images like this are priceless in that respect.
Could I just comment?
Yeah.
Spelling is Dremesdale with an E at the end.
With an E, yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure where this was taken in Dremesdale. And it doesn't show much of the coast. It actually shows more of the crofting system on the macar. But there's no harm in that because macars are very important landform for the crofters and others in the Uists and the Hebrides.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
That's all right. Let's move on to the next slide. And this one here is from Aberdeen, from the mouth of the Don in 1967. And here we see another aspect to coastal change and coastline evolution in these gabion baskets, which are in place here already in 1967. So that the story, for example, of shoreline loss due to climate change is actually not a new thing, and it was taking place in the 60s and the 40s and the 20s and so on. So that places like this example from Aberdeen show that local councils and other organisations were already concerned about shoreline erosion at that time. And I dare say if you went there today, you would find a different set of features. You might find fragments of these baskets still remaining, or it might be another bit of coastline where sand dunes have built up over the top of them, that kind of thing. But information on these old coastal defences is priceless, not least for the fact that it informs local government officers and a perspective of temporal change and the nature of and the speed of the changes that have taken place over time. Okay, next slide, please. And then off we go to a more remote location, which is Losset Bay, which is out on the west coast of the Rins of Islay. And there you'll see in 1973 a nice sandy beach, but you also see in the foreground evidence of dune erosion, probably caused by a mixture of human trampling, but also natural processes that have resulted in the erosion of the dunes, the vegetated dunes to the rear of Losset Beach. I've been to Losset Beach many times, and there's very, very few people who go there. So human trampling, although it is a contributing factor to dune erosion here, most probably storms and probably animal pressure and rabbits are some of the key drivers of dune erosion in this landscape. So you can go back there today and you may find that area of erosion then is not there anymore, and either there's the whole dune system stabilized now, or it has opened up new areas of erosion a few tens of meters along at the rear of this particular beach. Next one, please. Yeah, and this is more of a probably more value to the Scottish Tourist Board than anything else. It's the landscape of South Uist. And these rock surfaces are known to geologists as the Strand Flat. They make up these planated areas of rock that are so extensive across Benbecula and South Uist and North Uist and Tyree and Coll and so on. And they're evidence of sea level changes, but not sea level changes in terms of decades or hundreds of years, but in terms of millions of years. And they make up such an important and dominating element of the Hebridean landscape. So this particular slide won't tell you too much about that. It'll probably tell you some information about kelp and ecology, but it gives you a sense of the huge variety of types of images that have been put together. And the next one, please. This one here is of Crail in Fife. And again, for people interested in the effects of storminess change and sea level rise and sediment transport in beach areas. And we've just seen in that huge storm Babette, and then the following week with the exceptionally high tides, how there was a huge amount of sand removed from a lot of the beaches, certainly in eastern Fife, but also all along the coastline of eastern Scotland. And so an image like this, dating to 1978, can tell you, it can give you a reference point to compare with the present, so that you get a sense of whether these beaches are stable or are eroding or are building up. I can see, for example, I visited this beach fairly recently, and I'm sure that building at the rear of the beach isn't there anymore, and probably noticing changes in the distribution of gravel and sand on this particular beach. And the next one, please. I think this is that, isn't this the last one? I think this is a really interesting one from Cruden Bay in 1979. And you'll see, first of all, it's on the Excel spreadsheet, something like this would be, this particular slide would be, what do you describe in terms, because there's everything here. There's bits of rocky foreshore, there's vegetated dunes, there's sand beaches and so on. So in the spreadsheet, we describe this as a coastal panorama to encapsulate the sense of the image. And then there are close-up images of particular areas around Cruden Bay. Sorry, Bill?
I just wanted to butt in here. There's two features there that I think is worth mentioning. On the left side of you see these concrete blocks. These were put in place in the early 1940s and were beach defences against the possibility of invasion of the Scottish coastline. And many of them still occur, and I think some of them are even protected around the coastline of Scotland. But from a geomorphologist's point of view, they act as very good markers for change and the relationship of these concrete blocks, which are almost ubiquitous, particularly along the east coast of Scotland. And just as a little footnote, I can't actually point to the slide, but Cruden Bay at this end, at the north end, was the first area for the first pipeline from the North Sea to come into Britain.
Yeah, and some of the slides that I've seen that Bill took at this time, which are not yet digitized, I don't think, are photographs of the exact spot where the pipeline comes onto land. and we can see the pipeline trench. We can see everything. We can see the boats offshore, sort of getting the pipeline down into position and so on. And something like that is priceless, because Bill was actually there photographing this back what is now over 50 years ago. So again, you know, there are all sorts of ways in which people will find interest in these slides. The one particular viewer may be interested in some family aspect to an individual slide, but scientists will be interested in particular aspects of erosion, government officers in terms of coastal change and so on and so on. In other words, there's a great archive here that people can use for all sorts of purposes.
Mark, can I make a caveat? It's been very difficult for people to work with these slides, because sometimes the frame had handwriting on it, which was quite difficult to follow and get the exact dates. And I think we ought to say that there might be a few slides in the system that someone's going to look at and say, that's wrong, that's not there. And that's human error, not of the people doing the work here, but the original person who took the slide and wasn't very careful about annotation. So I think we should not make claims that every slide in the collection is absolutely perfect and correct. That there's human judgment involved, and that can lead to, well, little mistakes now and again.
I would just add to that in saying that the slides I've been looking at mostly have handwriting on the cardboard borders by Bill, and usually, as a true scientist, you always put the date. You always handwrote the date on the cover. But in addition to that, which you may have forgotten, is that Fujifilm or whoever were producing the slides put a little stamp on the slide. So there actually in many of the slides there are two dates, and I've been watching out to make sure that your handwritten date on an individual slide matches the actual date. And then Geethika comes along and double checks this, and there's going to be one of the columns in the Excel spreadsheet has the dates for each slide.
Well, by way of an apology.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Can you just go on to the next slide, please?
That's it.
Okay, so I'll just explain exactly what's in the archive as it stands. So it's essentially, it's an image database. It's linked in an SQL database to each of the images as a separate slide. It's got at the moment 870 records, of which we have 574 slides scanned. My suspicion is that by the time we're finished, it will probably be near to 1,000 slides scanned. We're double checking and trying to make sure that all of the information or the metadata attached to the slides is as correct as we can make it. All of the information will be online through the MASTS website, and there'll be a link that you can click on, and you will in a moment see what that link will look like. We will also lodge hard copies of the database itself, and the slides, as in physical slides, will be lodged with the University of St Andrews. And also the digital archive will have a digital object identifier that can be published and referenced. Can you go on to the next slide, Phil? And just play the video. This is just an explanation of how the database actually works.
I'm now going to just talk you through what the Coastal Image Archive looks like online. It will be going online sometime in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. It'll have a fairly straightforward front end like this with some description of what the archive is about. And you'll notice that there are a series of selection buttons on the left-hand side. These are drop-down lists, and you can select, for example, based on the year the image was taken. You can select on the county, if you like, or for example, a year range, or if you have a particular feature like a dune or a rocky shoreline, or even the name of a place that you want to search on, there's a free text search as well. So let's just start off, for example, by selecting our Argyll and Bute, and we want to select all of those images that were recorded in Argyll and Bute over the course of the survey work. What that produces is it comes up with a search results table here. You can see that there are a whole variety of different years in which the data from Argyll and Bute was recorded. There is the lat and long of each of the images, a location name as far as can be defined from the slide, and then more information, for example, around the description of the features that are contained within the slide. Most importantly, there is a unique slide number attached to each of this information here. If we scroll down all the way to the bottom of the data that it's produced, we get an interactive map. Each one of these icons represents a location where we have metadata and hopefully an image associated with it. So let's just click on that one, and you can see that we have the location details. So it's a slide 197, year taken was 1973 in Argyll and Bute, and it's Killannon Point. And the feature of interest here were embryo sand dunes. There are others that we can look at. In this case, you'll notice that it says the descriptor here, thumbnail. That means that we need to scan the image, and that will be something that we've done fairly shortly, and then there'll be a thumbnail associated with it and an image that you can download. Similarly on that one, if we go over here, thumbnail on that one. If we go up to these islands over here and go in, zoom in, so that we can look at each of the icons, and we can look at those. And again, these appear to have thumbnails, but there should be ones like this, for example, where you have an image and a descriptor attached to that image, and there should be lots of others that are associated with images as well. And that number will increase as we continue to scan. If we then, for example, decide, let's pick a particular example. Let's say we wanted to download information connected with slide number 441, then we can literally go backwards to our database, pick out slide 441, and then decide, for example, we want to download that image. It could be multiple, we can make multiple selections on the left-hand side here. So we'll just download that now. The selected image is downloaded into your folder, your downloads folder. When you open that up, you will see three sorts of file in there. You will find an image file that is a TIFF file, that's a lossless quality image, and each of those images is about 38 megabytes in size, and they're ideal for manipulating if you want to play with color quality, for example, or color balance, edit them in any way. All the images have already been cleaned. There shouldn't be any dust on them, and any damage has been removed. That's been done digitally. So in addition to the TIFF file, you also find an equivalent JPEG file, which is about 8 to 9 megabytes in size. Again, very good quality for a JPEG, but something else that you might find useful. And finally, there will be an Excel spreadsheet which contains all of the metadata related to the slides that you've selected for download. If I just take you back to the selection feature here, we've got Argyll and Bute. Let's say we want to select alternatively by year, and in this case we will select by, let's say, 1974, and run a search on 1974. You can see here within the date ranges it's all 1974, lots of different locations because lots of images were taken in 1974, and various images that we can now select and download if we wanted to. Scrolling down to the map, here are the images from 1974. Click on them, and we can see again that we have a thumbnail that we can look at and decide whether we want to look at that more closely or download it and have a good look at it. Hopefully what we will be able to do in the next iteration of the database is to link the original reports to each of the images, so that you'll be able to backtrack all the way through to the original report that relates to those images or to those locations. I hope that's been helpful. The whole thing hopefully will be on the MASTS website shortly, and we'll be making an announcement when it goes live.
Okay, I think if anybody has any questions, we're happy to answer any questions now, unless there are any other points that Bill and Alistair would like to make.
I seem to have done a lot of talking, and it was a team effort. I mean, I really want to stress that. And some of them aren't alive anymore. Some of them have been uncontactable, if that's the phrase. And there are others very kindly who've looked up their lofts and found slides, particularly of Shetland and Orkney. And it really was a lot of people that put a lot of work into this. But personally, I can't believe what a super job MASTS have done publicly. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can just say a couple of things. Yeah. I'd just like to add that if out there any of you are aware of slide boxes from the 60s, 70s, or 80s that are sitting gathering dust and cobwebs, then get them out your loft and send them to us, and they can add ultimately to that archive, because that's what it's all about. It's trying to get this information, as much information as possible. And then lastly, I'd like to just thank the team here, in particular Bill, because without this pioneering work, we would be nowhere. We'd be grasping at straws in terms of trying to understand coastal change. And you've provided through these reports and the images, you've left us a legacy that we can take forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions. I can see Colin Reed's got his hand up. Would you like to speak to us, Colin?
Yes, thank you very much for that. And you've just answered one of my questions, which was whether you're wanting more, because I've certainly got, I'm sure I've got my parents' childhood photographs of Kintyre and other beaches and so on. My more technical question was, one of the pictures, the Cruden Bay picture, had some of the Second World War defences.
Yes.
Are there records from the time of where those were put in relative to the shoreline and the dune lines? Because as you go up and down the coast, you see them, everything nowadays, from submerged to well back from the coast. And I was just wondering if we'd any indication at the time where they stood in relation to the shoreline.
Oh, thank you. One of the areas that also has these is the outline landfalls at St Fergus, and the other ones are at Balmedy that I know personally. And I'm afraid, I think the idea was that they were done sometime like 1940 or 1941. I know people have tried to get exact dates from the Ministry of Defence, but I think that's going to be quite difficult to do. But I have a vague feeling that one of the heritage bodies in Scotland have actually listed some of them as being of a national interest. For example, there was a machine gun site in the inner post-glacial cliff at St Fergus, and I know that there certainly, that can't be touched, it can't be modified, it can't be broken up, but I don't know the government agency that's responsible. It must be, I think, Historic Scotland.
Yeah, I would just also say, Colin, there's the RAF flew a set of aerial photographs in 1948 at a scale of 1 to 25,000. And all these photographs are sitting in Edinburgh with Historic Environment Scotland. And I dare say, if these were, that might make a good project for somebody, for a student to go there and just enlarge them a bit, and then you should be able to see where these tank traps were in 1948.
Thank you.
Okay. And I can see Steve McFarlane's got his hand up.
Hi there. That was brilliant. So I have a stack of questions, but I'm not going to ask them all now. Maybe follow up. But I appreciate you've got a time frame there. 60s, 70s, 80s. For many people looking at change in coast and focusing in on communities, it'd be good if we could expand that range of timescales, particularly back in time. And you mentioned yourself there those sets of aerial photographs, and I guess the first thing I'm interested in is, is there a scope in the future to extend this in terms of the decades that you're actually looking for photographs for and logging them for? Because I think that would, make what's already a great resource, even more valuable. So I'll ask that one, and then if there's time, I've got another one I'll come back on. Thanks.
Can I say that that's an excellent idea? There's a huge variety of resources out there already. I mean, in particular in places in Edinburgh, the photographic records from aerial, the RAF flights, as Alistair said. And there are other sources. It's a bit of of interest that there's a bit of a gap in that when coastal engineers look to do something engineering on the coast, they go to maps, then they go to aerial photographs. But here's another source of information. But it'd be great. But from experience, I'm looking at Mark here, this doesn't come free. If you've got somebody doing research, if they've got to be remunerated in some way. So I think that there may be some thought need to be given to how this might be financed if it's going to go forward into the future. Maybe Mark could say more about that.
I think this was essentially an initiative to digitize all of the slides that Bill and Alistair were able to provide us with. In terms of expanding it, it would be helpful if now we have a system in place for recording the images and a system in place for linking those images through a database to make them available through a website. All of, if you like, the hard work, all the heavy lifting has been done. And so it would actually be relatively small cost for somebody to continue to just scan slides and enter the requisite information and for the database to be updated. So I think it's one of those things where we can discuss it. The main thing is to get the archive that we have in a fit state where all of the images are correct. All of the metadata that we know within the archive is correct, and then we can start adding to that sequentially. So I think it's a sort of an open conversation, but certainly I think now the foundation is there, it's relatively easy to add to. I've got a few questions that have come through on the chat. One which is obviously from Karen D. And basically they're looking for, will there be any publicity for the launch? Yes, there will be, in the sense that we'll make it as public as we can through the MASTS comms team when the system is live. Stuart Angus has commented that the Scape Trust mapped all of the structures that Bill was referring to in terms of coastal defences. So the Scape Trust obviously have records of that. Eddie Chapman has asked, is there a cut-off date for the photographs? So I think I'd probably hand that back to Bill and Alistair in terms of the sort of timescales that they think are important to include in the archive.
Well, Alistair's still active in consultancy work and pure research in coastal geomorphology, and I think he should answer that question. But in my own view, there really was a step change when digital photography took over. Most of these images were literally on film, which was expensive. You got 36 photographs in a roll, and you had to send them away to Kodak or Fuji or whatever. But what I'm seeing now today is as you move forward in time and mobile phones came in with digital image, there's hardly a person with a digital phone who doesn't have 800 or 900 or 1,000 images. So there's something there about the technology, and we have to recognise that there is a kind of a break. And in my mind, it was probably in the early 1990s.
Thank you. I've got a number of photos, but they are about mid-90s, so that's why I was wondering. Still on film, but they are from the mid-90s. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, probably one of the things that we will do once it's been launched is look at the feasibility of adding records, and it may well be that we could put out a call once we've discussed it, and put out a call for any other sort of film-based records that could be lost that might be of value. But we'll talk about that at a later date. Can you see any more questions, Phil? Because I can't obviously see the whole screen.
No questions that I can see. We've had a few people put their hands up and hands down.
I can see one from Kat.
Yeah, can I just ask a quick one? And I know this is probably something you maybe can't do, but when you've been talking, you seem to have a lot of knowledge about the certain dates and whether the beach was potentially had just been subject to a storm or not. And for our perspective, that would be really valuable to know. So if you know that there had just been a storm, so therefore that beach was quite eroded, or whether actually it'd been a long. So I just wondered if that was something that you were putting a note about, if you just happen to know that, okay, when that photograph was taken, there was a big storm event and it did cause a lot of damage or not.
That's actually a difficult question, because almost all of the slides were taken in what I would call the summer period, from May through to September. When I used to teach coastal geomorphology, I said the time to look at coast and understanding what's happening, you should go in winter, because that's when you get the storms and that's when you see the change. So I think, sadly, unless there were one or two, like Alistair mentioned, at the mouth of the Don, which he used as an example, in the field, there was no correlation made with severe weather, but it would be noted, because even in summer, you get very obvious changes. If there's been a big storm and a high tide, and then there's usually a cliff on the sand, and the drainage has been affected as well. But it wasn't, to answer your question, it wasn't systematic in the sense of the answer to your question.
I can add that some of the slides do have month dates with it, so they're essentially got a month and a year, and that's captured in the database as well. So you would at least be able to identify most of them to month, I believe.
Yes, it's a brilliant resource. Well done for all the hard work that's gone into it. So it's really hard to find photographs of changes in the coastline, and to have it all there in a database like that, it's just amazing. So yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So any further questions? I can't see any more in the chat. Anything that you can see, Phil?
We've
Steve's
got
back?
one hand up from
Sorry.
Steve McFarlane.
Yeah, I'll be greedy and come back for a second one. You mentioned there, I think when you're talking about Tentsmuir, about how the beach had changed from more recent visits, and I think you mentioned Crail as well. Do you get a sense for an overall pattern of what change you see, and are they consistent across all the photographs, or is there a trend that most of the photographs follow that you can see for yourself? And what would that sort of, if you were to sum up how the beaches have changed in a couple of sentences, what would you say?
So much, Alice.
Oh, well, that's a really difficult question to answer, but could I just use the example of St Andrews and the golf courses as an example? Now, way back in 1850, the half of the golf course area and the links of St Andrews was under the sea. It was only half the size that it was. And from the 1850s through to the 1930s, it doubled in size, because the the beach was advancing all the time. New sand dunes were being created. And so what we see now is almost an illusion from the point of view of a time scale of 200 years, because it's so far advanced. But yet when you go, as we have done, and looked at the effect of some of the storms in the last 3 winters, this winter, previous winter, nothing happened. The winter before that, we had Storm Arwen and so on. And you'd see that, for example, in Storm Arwen, the wind was from the north, and there were specific sections of the beach that were building up because of wind blowing and piling sediment up against the coastal edge, the dune cliffs, and other sections of the coastline not far away that were being stripped back by meters. And likewise with Storm Babette, the very opposite thing happened with easterly winds, and southeasterly winds, so that the currents were coming up on a high tide and eroding large sections of the west sands of St Andrews, but not doing anything in the estuary, in the Eden estuary to the north. So it's really site specific, and individual events have a huge effect. But then when you jump back 50 years or 100 years, all that information disappears and you get a net change. You've lost the detail, but you're seeing the longer term perspective.
I'd like to back Alistair up in that, and at the risk of wasting your time, I remember doing a webinar for MASTS some time ago, and the whole point of it was just how regional the coastlines of Scotland are. We tend to get people generalising, particularly about, say, sea level rise, and it's as if Scotland was all the same, from Shetland right down to the estuaries and the Solway. And basically, I think Alistair will agree, you can't extrapolate across the whole of Scotland for, say, a storm on, say, the east coast. Maybe nothing happened on the west coast. So it's an extremely difficult question to answer. And I think the good news is that there's still young people, young research people, working on the coastline of Scotland in particular occasions. And I think at some point in the future, somebody's going to put all these together and recognise the regionality that we have in Scotland, you know, from Shetland right down to the Solway.
So we're coming close to the end of the meeting now. I'm not seeing any more hands up. If anybody's got more questions, just put them in the chat, or email us directly at MASTS, and we can convey those questions to Bill and to Alistair as needed. I think it's really just thanks very much, particularly to Geethika, who's done a lot of the work in terms of the scanning work and entering a lot of the data into the spreadsheets and correcting that for us, and particularly to Alistair, who spent many happy hours trying to decipher Bill's writing and others and entering that into the database. But thank you again. Unless there are any more comments, I think we'll close the meeting there.
Thanks to the technical people. This is brilliant.
Thank you, Phil. Okay.
Thank you, Phil.
And thank you for everybody that has participated.